China is set to host its first ever military World Games as athletes from around the world will compete in a 10-day event. But there is a broader aim too. What role can sports play in military diplomacy and to improve relations between militaries? On another front, international exchanges between the U.S. and China may soon take another hit. What damage will be done if the Trump administration follows through on a threat to restrict U.S. visas to Chinese officials and civil servants? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. The 7th Military World Games will soon kick off in Wuhan, central China, the first time that China will host what's dubbed Olympic Games for military personnel across the globe. Indeed, from October the 18th to 27th, some 10,000 athletes from more than 100 countries and regions will compete in 27 sports. That said, this event is about much more than the unifying spirit of sport among world-class athletes. For China, it's also seen as a component of military diplomacy. What does China hope to achieve by hosting and participating in such an event? And what are the broader objectives of China's military diplomacy? Joining me in the studio are Zhao Tong, a fellow with the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, and Professor Lixia, a research fellow at the Institute of American Studies in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, for years, China has embraced and advocated a military diplomatic stance of peace through dialogue. Professor Liu, let me ask you this question to begin with. What exactly does military diplomacy mean for China, and whether you can give us a few examples? For instance, what does China mean by military diplomacy?
Actually, the military diplomacy is part of China's path of peaceful rise. It's our national policy. So in the military area, we encourage mil-to-mil communications between of different countries, and that's the spirit of our military policy.
Dr. Zhao, help us understand exactly what this military diplomacy is all about, because it seems to be a rather unique term, right? We don't hear so much from other countries, for instance, from the United States, not to my knowledge, talking about a diplomacy in terms of military.
Well, indeed, even with the United States, which is imposing increasing pressure on China across the board, military diplomacy between U.S. and China, for example, has been playing a very important role for promoting mutual understanding and mutual trust. Despite the U.S. conducting of close-range surveillance and reconnaissance activities by aircrafts and vessels near Chinese coast, the Chinese military has a long-standing dialogue mechanism with the U.S. armed forces. They have constant and regular exchanges at various levels, from senior military officials all the way to working-level officers. And those dialogues play a very important role for them to understand how they view the dispute in this area and how to, avoid accidents if the two military vessels and airplanes encounter each other in this area. So it helps to avoid crisis and how to manage crisis and prevent inadvertent escalation during a crisis.
Can we say it's an effort to reach out to the public as well to foreign counterparts on the part of China to help people understand? So what does this kind of military world game play in terms of helping people understand each other, helping militaries understand each other, Professor Liu?
Sports is a physical competition. If you join a sports game, you suppose that you don't have minds. So people can put aside their different opinions, and they can communicate despite there might be very different views. So this is very important for military people because
they're supposed to fight each other.
They're
supposed to be confronting each other.
So for military people, they are supposed to fight each other, but at military game, they can communicate to each other.
So is that something unique, I mean, this military diplomacy, or is it something that China sees of particular significance when China's rise is being seen by some outside of China as a threat? Therefore, China feels a particular need to foster understanding and friendship between the Chinese military and its foreign counterparts, Dr. Zhao.
I think it's very important because China needs to send different signals and messages simultaneously to different audiences. To countries that potentially threaten China, China needs to send a signal of deterrence by showing off its strong military power. But at the same time, China has a great interest to reassure other international members that China does not mean to coerce or bully them. So that's why military diplomacy is particularly important. In the case of the sports game, for example, if China invites other militaries to attend, they basically can foster this common understanding that just like in a sport game, different military forces, they can compete fiercely in defending their national interests. But still, as long as they play by the rules, they can still exist peacefully and even make friends with each other. I think that's the spirit that military diplomacy wants to foster. More importantly, by conducting these personal level interactions, it does help the personnel from different armed forces develop deeper understandings about each other. They can understand that they are all normal, family-loving, decent people.
To humanize.
Professional, right?
To humanize.
Professionals, right?
Yeah.
So they can help dismiss the worst-case, thinking in the minds of potential adversaries.
Yeah. Well, on the other hand, watching from outside, there might be people who say this is a show, maybe, that China has put on to put a deceiving gloss over the true nature of the Chinese military or intentions, which is to expand and to enlarge its sphere of influence. Is this a show or some kind of public relations spin that China is putting out there to send a false message about its military?
First of all countries need some work on public relations, like all business corporations. They do it, we do it. But for China, in military theories, usually we talk about capabilities and intentions. China, on the one side, China needs to show its capability in deterrence and defense, and on the other side, we need to show our intention, or we are not prepared for any kind of active offense. Our military is purely for defense.
Some people might also pitch this kind of message with the images that came out of the Tiananmen Square military parade that we just saw at the beginning of October, saying, look, China, you just showed your latest military hardware and flexing muscles, and now you're calling for friendship, understanding. Are these mixed messages that are coming out of the Chinese military or Chinese government, Dr. Zhao? How can you explain, help people understand that?
I think different interpretations are inevitable because different countries have their own perspectives. They focus on different aspects of things. But I think China has been improving the ways it is sending signals. Previously, Chinese rhetorical policy is very abstract, general. We are a peace-loving nation, but that doesn't really help much. But increasingly, China has been providing more transparency in military doctrine and operations. The recent National Defense White Paper released by the Defense Ministry, for example, goes into depths about the specific figures of Chinese military defense budget, and that helps put things into perspectives. If you can explain that Chinese defense budget growth is modest compared with other countries, no more than 2% of its GDP, no more than 5% of its government spending. So that helps people better understand the Chinese military growth without exaggerating the threat.
If such white paper gets carried on international media so that more and more people would understand, would hear the kind of messages that China wants to send out, and that leads to my next question. How effective has China's military diplomacy been? I mean, what have been the reactions reactions? Do we know of any reactions to this kind of public outreach?
China has sent its largest military hospital ship, the Peace Ark, to over dozens of countries in the past few years, providing, in most cases, free medical services to hundreds of thousands of people in Africa and other countries. That really helps building ties and personal connections with local communities. And at the military level, it is indeed very hard to dismiss distrust on military doctrines, but over time, I think China, for example, in the case of its nuclear doctrine, it has sponsored exchanges with military officials explaining and helping them understand that in the Chinese military doctrine, the no first use policy is not only a rhetorical policy, but also it is implemented thoroughly by the Chinese military all the way to the operational level. All the soldiers on the ground who operate the missiles and nuclear weapons are complying with not using nuclear weapons first. By providing these nuanced details, I think that is helpful over time to make Chinese diplomacy more effective and convincing.
Is China's military diplomacy also only about helping militaries understand each other, or does it also include reaching out to the general public in foreign countries as well? The most recent piece of information that we've seen in the Chinese media is Chinese ship making port call in East Timor, for instance, inviting local government officials, local military personnel and local people to, and not just Chinese living there, but also other local people who are interested in seeing the ship. How important is that kind of program for China's military diplomacy, if you would like to?
Military people are in every country, in each and every country, military people is a small portion of the whole population. And so you need to let other people, the rest of the people, to learn what the military is and what they are doing. So this is important for military to show what they are for, what they are capable for. So that's important.
Yeah, and is China going to do more of such diplomacy, either hosting games or exchanges or joint military drills or port calls or open gate events for local people, Dr. Zhao?
I think the number of such activities that China has conducted over the recent years have already increased dramatically compared with decades before. In the case of the Chinese escorting ships in and around the Gulf of Aden, that has made China able to conduct port calls to hundreds of visits to regional countries that help build ties with countries in those regions. But if you look at the overall number of Chinese military diplomatic activities with that of the United States, the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command's 7th Fleet. The 7th Fleet alone of the United States conducts about the same number of military diplomatic activities annually as China as a whole. So there's still a long way to go, and China, I think, has a lot to learn from examples of other powers.
All right. So we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Dr. Zhao Tang from the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. And Professor Liu is going to stay with us for our next discussion, which is about the U.S. proposed policy to restrict visa for some Chinese Communist Party officials and civil servants for alleged human rights violations in Xinjiang. Stay with us. We'll be back right after this short break.